Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we're going to be talking about how good we had it as a car community in the last 25 years. I know that a lot of people have been bitching and moaning left and right about just how horrible the current situation of cars has been for us. And today I would like to kind of reflect on that in a historical sense and try to make a case for what made cars so good in the past, and also what are some of the movements that happened within the car culture such that we have it as it is today. So we're kind of looking at the true story of tuning history, that is cars that are very cheap, that everyone was able to afford, and that really made an impact in terms of performance. And I made this little collage here to show off some really cool cars, I think, personally. And really, this is going to be a part one of a two-part series. The first part is going to be the reminiscing, which is how good we had it. The second part, I believe, is going to be something more modern, 2012 plus car community and how it works today. And these are some of the cars I think were pretty interesting in the last 2 decades. Right here, we have a first gen Toyota Celica, which kind of looks like a Mustang. This is a Hennessy Viper. This is a Sylvia. That's a Pontiac Sky, and I believe it's a supercharged version. So the red line. That's a STSV. This is obviously an SRT8. That's a Mitsubishi 3000 GT. This is a Supra. That is a Z06, a C5. That's a RX-7 FB. That's a Mach 1 Mustang. That's a Prelude, my bad. This is a STI, obviously, it's a second gen. This is it's a Dodge Dakota RT, which has been kind of like a rat rod build. This is an SLP Firehawk, which is based off of Firebird. This is a Jeep Hot Rod. And finally, right here, we have a Nissan Pulsar. So these are some cars that we've seen in this kind of era. And they're all, I mean, not all of them are of, 97 to 2011, but these are cars that people built at that time. And, that distinction is pretty important, and we'll talk about it later. So, in retrospective, the 90s were not actually that great for cars. I know that a lot of people nowadays, we have these like retro styled videos that show off like 90s drifting and so on and so forth. But actually, most of the cars that were iconized at this time were actually unobtainium cars of that time. Like today we have Bugattis, Zagatos, Paganis, and so on and so forth. Yeah, Koenigsegg's. And those are now the cars that we, iconize and consider, you know, unnaturally expensive, and so you will never buy one. But back then, it was actually the opposite. We had pretty cheap cars overall. I mean, $200,000, $300,000 cars, but they made so little of them that in fact we didn't really get to see them all that often. And right here we have a really good example of that. This is like your Need for Speed Hot Pursuit lineup. And what do you see here? It's a Lotus, 355, a Viper, a Porsche Turbo, and an NSX. And out of all those cars, I mean, most of them were extremely rare. I mean, other than maybe the Viper and the F355, you might have seen a couple of those, in your city. But most of these cars, you would see like single-digit numbers at any place in the Americas. And the reality of it is that people will go to their old school diners or their coffee place, and they would show up with usually Hondas. A lot of Hondas, some old muscle cars, but usually the youth had their little Hondas. And for the most part, when you talked about serious car meets, we were talking about splitting between classics, really classic cars, the 40s till the 50s, and your muscle cars. And there was no such thing as like your JDM car meet. That happened a little later, and we will be going through that. Most of them were just econo boxes with two doors. That's really what people don't understand. When you're talking about your Grand Prix and your Mazda 626s and such, a lot of these cars, you could get exactly the same engine and drivetrain in a bigger car. And it was just the fact that they were smaller, that they were a little bit sportier, and they also rode really crap that people liked to drive them. And that really kickstarted, I think, the whole car community, like the modern car community that we have today. But there was no such thing as ECU tuning. I mean, a lot of these cars were still carbureted. eBay, obviously not. The internet wasn't really a thing. Turbos, forget about it. Most people didn't even see a turbo in their whole lifetime. And this really only started like getting really, really popular in the mid 2000s. So let's see that. Here I have a couple of cool pictures. So this is kind of what you would expect nowadays. Like when you think of like, mid 90s sports car, maybe you think of big wing, some splitters and so on and so forth. That really came out of your DTM style racers, and also your autocross, like your modern day autocross racers, which are really inspiring themselves from the 90s, of course. But we're talking about multi-million dollar teams that nowadays we can reproduce their racing model on a budget. So for instance, this Acura Integra, a Honda Integra, it's, rebadged. That thing might be a K20 swap. Well, K20s didn't exist at this time. And it might have some extremely stiff suspension. Well, at that time, you had to CNC, like custom CNC that shit. And so you couldn't really do it. There was no carbon fiber. You look at the sidewalls of the car, and you see a roll cage. That's a custom roll cage. Back then, nobody did that. The same thing for the Mustang here. This is a really nice, SN95 Fox body Mustang, and it's pretty much fully custom. This is like homemade, fully custom, and back then that was just not the case. What you actually got is like this up here. This is the Top Gear or Comparo, or it might be a Motor Week Comparo. I'm not quite sure, but you look at these cars, and most of them are like $50,000 to $60,000 in today's money, which is ridiculous because the average car in this list was making sub 200 horsepower. So that's really what you were getting on the road. It was really econoboxes if you think about it. And the really cool car meets, the ones where you got to see like very expensive cars, were actually the factory car meets. So these are like the auto shows and the conferences that would happen. So these were manufacturer-centric car shows. And yeah, you got to see a lot of cool cars, but generally speaking, it was not what you have today. Today, it has to do with mostly people of the middle class that are able to afford these cars. So the excitement really started in the mid-90s when the late Gen X, these guys getting 20s, 25s, started getting introduced to international racing, which was usually street style. So when you think of the big boys, we're really talking about NASCAR, Formula One, and Japanese street racing, or sometimes, GT3, things like that. And that was really spearheaded by a couple of factors. One of them was the internet, of course. People were watching more internet content, and they were getting this gist that in other places in the world, people are actually racing their little shit boxes. And it was really hard for people to understand. We got a little glimpse of it with the sports motorcycles that were coming in the lineups, like the Super Blackbirds and things like that. But at this time, it was still not really common to see those kinds of motorcycles on the road. And of course, that didn't translate to cars just yet. But one thing I think that really affected a lot of people was the importation of books and movies and TV shows from other countries. So a really good example that we started getting was Blockbuster third-rate releases and indie video. So Blockbuster was one of the first companies that really allowed for small publishers to bring on their DVDs on their front shelf. And this allowed for our street racing culture to strive. So really good example is the Super Speeders series. You got Ghost Rider, Superbike, Initial D, of course, and all the NASCAR content you could think of. But we also got magazines. We had a lot of hot rodding magazines. We had a bunch of used car magazines that were really popular at this time. And we also got, other motorsport magazines, like, for instance, Hot Version. That's one that I personally read a lot. And, of course, we got video games. Gran Turismo 3 is a very good example of this game, of this kind of content media. Because in Gran Turismo 3, you could actually race on the streets. There were some tracks that were based off of street racing. You had tuning that started getting involved, and we started getting a lot of Japanese inspiration for our youth. And of course, we were getting young NASCAR drivers like Jeff Gordon absolutely dominating the NASCAR track and kind of revitalizing that inspiration and excitement for this motorsport. So that was really cool. And right around when the Gen X started making families and getting cheap loans for their houses is when they started having cash laying around. And this is when the market really blew up for the automakers. So right around the mid 90s is when we got introduced to the fast econobox. So these are cars that were now finally hitting over 150 horsepower and allowed for a lot of tunability. And also you will notice that they were very, very cheap. So here's a couple examples. The main one that I think of that I keep coming back to is the 1996 Eagle Talon TSI all-wheel drive. Now, the regular TSI was a pretty good platform, but when introducing the all-wheel drive version at a very reasonable price, this was $39,000 of today's money. Back then, it was the equivalence of a minimum wage job working for about a year. You could buy off the lot a beautiful two-door sport coupe that had a 4G63 turbo engine in it, and it was all-wheel drive, so it was actually really, really fast for the time. It was easy to modify it, especially the second gen, and it gave you a lot of benefits as a motorsport enthusiast. Hey, I can get myself a JDM car out the factory that's very cheap and easy to modify. That's something that was unheard of before. I mean, there are some predecessors. I've made videos on predecessors to this car, but this car is like the is like the embodiment of this movement. Another really good example, maybe a little bit more on the low end, is something like a 1998 Honda Civic SI-R. Now, the SI-R we got in Canada, in the States it was just called the SI. We got a couple of differences off the two, but really what you were getting was a two-door sport coupe making 130 horsepower and with a really cheap MSRP, $32,000. You could get one of these off the lot for less than 20 grand of today's money, and that was a really good idea. Honda made a couple of versions of this. Obviously, they made the Acura Integra, which is a beautiful two-door coupe version of it. They also had the Del Sol. They had the Prelude, if you wanted something a little bit more premium, and also that made a lot more power once you turboed them. Obviously, turbo kits were not quite a thing just yet, but that's coming in pretty soon. You also could get the Toyota Celica. You could get a 2.5 RS Impreza. You could get a Corrado or a Scirocco. You could get a MR2, which is a little bit more expensive, but just as fun. And you could get a turbo. And of course, you had your muscle cars. The muscle cars were finally getting really, really good at this time, making over 230 horsepower and up. And you could buy an old Fox body, for instance, as well, and build the platform to its limits. The Windsor 5.0 was a really good idea back then to build up. The Silvia is another classic. I mean, it was a little more expensive than the rest of the cars, but when people started buying them on the used dealer lot, that's really when we started modding these cars and they started getting really good. Obviously, the from the big JDM legend cars, the 300ZX twin turbo and the 3000 GT or the Stealth RT, whichever naming badge you prefer, were some really cheap options as well. They were around 50 grand, which is not bad. It's Corvette money at that time. And of course, at this time also, something that was really big was Nissan Z modifications. So people would buy these 240Zs of either from their parents or maybe from a barn find or whatnot, and they would put usually either a small block Chevy engine in it, or they would put something Japanese. So sometimes you get 4 cylinders like SR20 or things like that, and that became really, really popular. So the Zs became kind of your first engine swap car. And the fun really, really kicked off in the 2000s when the manufacturers wanted to directly compete with the modding community, starting giving us more and more performance. Really, at this point in the the early to mid 2000s is when you started getting past the 200 wheel horsepower mark, and you could get it for even cheaper than before. So these 40 grand numbers, you could even get it for cheaper back then. Turbo kits started getting really popular. There were actually 2 magazines that would sell you turbo kits for different cars, and they were pretty easy to build because at this time ECUs were not that complex to tune. You had a real performance bargain uh, series of championships for amateurs, which was the autocross. The SCCA had an autocross before, but they changed the rules to allow more flexibility with the cars that you would choose, and this allowed for tuners to actually get involved into racing like that. Also, quarter mile drag strips started getting more and more popular, so a lot of manufacturers were building cars for that, and also a lot of tuning companies were getting involved into that, and that allowed for the market to naturally grow. Here are some of my favorites. So obviously you had the better econo boxes. So the new RSX, which replaced the Integra, had a K20A. It's the only car we got that had a K20A from the factory. We got a Cobalt SS, which is a supercharged Cobalt. It was really cool little car. It was one of the cheaper ones, obviously because it's domestic. You had the WRX. This is the second gen, but even the first gen was absolutely incredible at that time. Neon SRT4, also really cheap option, and here that's a Saturn Ion, but there's a bunch of other cars here. I got a Celica, I got a S2000, I got this one is a Mitsubishi with the V6. That one is, a little slept on, but it was kind of like a 3000 GT that they took out the turbos. It was pretty cool for the price. Obviously, you got a revitalization of V8s with the truck market. This is like very early 2000s. They were trying to test out that kind of performance with the domestics. They didn't want to make the same mistake as the muscle cars, which was like build a bunch of muscle car platforms and then, get emissions regulated and just basically losing all of that investment. So they started off with trucks because they knew that was a sure thing. And of course, Miatas started getting really, really popular for racing purposes, and Spec Miata was getting popular. And we also got a very big muscle car explosion. As I said before, you had your trucks that were doing the safe thing. And when they realized that the truck engines, the V8s that they were using, were actually pretty good to put in their muscle cars, and, they wouldn't really get any emissions regulation failures or suing by carbs, they started putting their truck motors, their big tuning truck motors, into their muscle cars again. So really the big two here is the LS and the Cobra motors. The LS, the history of it is that the 90s engines, well, for both of these, were really failures. When we're talking about the LT engine, which is a Gen 2 small block, it was really the fueling system and the spark plug system. It just wasn't that good. It was some sort of like weird single MPFI system, and it was called the OptiSpark, and people really didn't like it. When it got oil on it, it just started failing very badly. People later on, around like the 2000s, mid 2000s, started figuring out how to actually make power out of it. But at this time, they were considered like pretty bad for like modding purposes. So a lot of people were selling off their old Camaros and also Mustangs. Those two valves, they were horrible. People hated the 4.6. They preferred the Windsor, and the Cobra 4 valve really saved that Mustang platform there, because it would have been a complete loss otherwise. But again, those older 90s cars, like the mid 90s Camaros and Mustangs, we're gonna talk about them for a bit, but for a long time, they were just dead weight in the modding community. With the LS1, the introduction of the LS1, however, that's when we started getting some really interesting performance. So a lot of factory modding communities, they figured out how to put forced induction on it, and they started making 600 wheel horsepower with them. A little later on, people figured out that with the Cobras, you could do the same thing with a 4-valve 4.6, putting a Procharger, so that's a factory turbocharger that spins with the crank, and that thing would also produce around 600 wheel. Obviously, when the SVT Cobra Terminator came out, that also put it at a different ball game. But those LS1s, I think, really dominated the early 2000s. And so here's a couple of good examples here. So we have, obviously, the Camaro LS1. Then we have a Terminator right here. This is a 3-valve, S197, which came a little later, obviously, but they were pretty awesome too. This is a Pontiac GTO that replaced the Camaro, and it was based off the same platform as the Cadillac, which is right here. Also a pretty awesome little car. And obviously the C5 Corvette, which was cheaper than the C4s, some of the C4s. And with the LS1, I mean, you got all the performance you ever would want. And that is also a big classic, I would say, with the, garage collectors guys. We also got a huge revitalization. We also got a bunch of JDM Legend for the budget, and I think it really came into the theme of the turbo 4 cylinder. So at this time, the turbos were finally getting really popular, and a lot of engines, it was either that you got a factory turbo and you could modify it to make a bit more power, or you would buy a 4 cylinder that was NA, and you would be able to get big power unlocks. So here's a couple of examples here: the K20, the SR20, the D16, and also the B16, if just to some extent. The 4G63 in some very particular cases, although they weren't that popular. The F20C that came a little later, but the 3SGE, those are really the big ones. Obviously, BPZE, which is the Miata engine, was also pretty popular, but the B6ZE was more popular because you could put on a 323 GTR or a GTS turbo kit, and that would work right away. We also got the SVT Ford engine, which was NA, and some people like supercharging them, but those were all really big power unlock engines, and a lot of tuning companies, especially like TV show companies and things like that, they really liked the D16. That was a big boy. Also the B20 that we saw in the CRVs, those were pretty cool as well. For the turbocharged ones that people like to build up later on, we got the 4G63T, which was a lot more prevalent than the regular 63, and I mean were some of the best built engines from the factory. I mean they flowed really really well. Port and just a quick turbo, and that's it. You were making 400 wheel. Although they weren't as reliable as some other cars, obviously. The EJ, that was a really big one, especially in Canada. We love our Imprezas. It's something about that all-wheel drive manual turbo 4 that we just love. Obviously, they're not that well built, but we have a lot of tuning companies that built that stuff up for us. A really good example is Leshut Performance, which have been building EJ engines literally for 20 years now, and they love building them. The 4B11T, obviously, but that one came a lot later. The 3SGTE, which was a MR2, and Altezza, and a bunch of other little cars that we got, which are really slept on, to be honest. Like 3SGTE was big power, really early on in the mid 90s, I would say. And of course, when the domestic kind of got into it, the SRT4 and the SS/SC engines were really well built, and people really like them. Even today, I mean, the Ecotec engines are still very popular. I think that the SRT4 engine would have been more popular if they kept making them, but if you want a one and done like 600 wheel 4-banger, I mean the SRT4 is the dominant one out of this list. It's basically an Evo engine, but can take more boost, and it's way cheaper than any Evo engine now. And here's a couple examples of like tuning cars, like really popular ones. So obviously a lot of people had their Hondas from either early in the 90s, and now they just got a bunch of money, so now they could plop in a bunch of money in their EcoBox. So the Honda Civics were really popular. People were doing like all kinds of swaps, but really when the Honda Civic became like extremely popular was when they started putting K20s, K24s, and also some V6s. That's when like it completely unlocked it. You were getting like rust bucket Honda Civics making like easily 400, 500 horsepower, no problem. Really easy mods, like just building out your garage, and that became really big. I mean, nowadays we're talking like people are like exaggerating it, but back then it was still like a big deal. Here you got Mitsubishi Eclipse, so that's a first gen, and people still like them a lot back then. I mean, that's why they had it in the Fast and Furious, and that 4G63T. I mean, nowadays they're super rare, but back then they were like dime a dozen, just like the K20. Actually, K20 was more expensive, which was big thing back then. But the 63T, I mean, still 400 wheel, no problem. Very little mods. MR2, obviously. There was a time where actually MR2s were like just as expensive as Miatas. Miatas, because of the turbo setups, they had a lot of turbos. Here I have a Protege 5. That one was slept on because it was a 2-liter turbo. It's not as popular. SRT4 and WX right there. But then also we had here's some bonus mentions, some really cool engines that people didn't really give a good chance, but back then were technologically more advanced than everyone else. The 13B, obviously, that we saw in the RX-7 and RX-8. In the RX-8, they were kind of write-offs, but what was cool is that they had extended warranty on them, so people would buy them as leasers, and then they would just drive the crap out of them. They would just swap the engine 3-4 times and then buy out the car, and it was usually a pretty good deal for them. Also, the MRS, so the MR2 Spiders, had the 2ZZ at one point. You had also Corolla XRS and the Celica GTS. Those are really cool cars to have. They revved out. They were kind of like uh, a K20, or sorry, a B18 on steroids. So they were making, they could rev out to 9,000 RPM, but they were best NA, just like the B18. And so they were pretty cool for a lot of people. I mean, if you wanted something NA, not super fast, but something that could actually like, you could do canyon runs or daily drivability. I think the 2ZZ made a lot of sense over the K20. K20 just used up more gas. We also got a huge splurge in the JDM Legend, and I think this is where the legendary status of JDM came from, obviously. But also, I want to mention that this is kind of just a revitalization of what we got in the muscle car community. I mean, if when you talk about like a Supra, well, we had the Pontiac Judge back then, or when you talk about the RX-7, well, back then you had the Chevelle SS. These are all kind of like comparable in terms of different generations, right? One was the Boomers, one was the Gen X, and also Millennials. And how Japanese domestic really hit the market, I would say, is two things. The first one was the economic crash in Japan. That allowed for a lot of insurance companies, but also just like factory companies, OEMs, that wanted to sell in bulk a bunch of parts for JDM, for Japanese cars. So that came into California and Vancouver, and people started buying them. So that's how we got our turbo kits or factory turbo kits, and we got a bunch of other stuff like when you talk about like Japanese wheels, that's another part. Or when you talk about like big wings and things like that. Like this is stuff that Japan had for over 10 years, even some people say like 15 years, and we just started getting them like late 90s for much cheaper. So that was pretty cool. Another thing, and I think this is where the JDM Legends really started, was people, Japanese executives that lost their jobs or had to go back to Japan, and then they would sell their cars that they imported. So a really good example is like the early GTRs. Most of them had Japanese titles, and were not legally allowed to stay in the U.S. But through cash payments and selling through the mob or whatever, they got into modding hands, and people started modding them and putting on Sylvia titles on them. So they were completely illegal, but people would just race them on the track, so that was totally fine. NSXs, same thing. We got a huge surge of NSXs. They were really rare in the States, and we got a bunch of them through the Japan connection, obviously. Supers is the same thing, although we had Supers in Canada and the US. Actually, people were importing Canadian Supras into the States because we had a really bad market for them. People hated them out here. Evos is another good example, although Evos we mostly got much later on when the JDM laws affected Canada. Actually, most of the Evos came out of Canadian ships and brought into the US. So that's a pretty interesting thing. That's also why they're more so a West thing and not an East thing. East Coast, we prefer Subarus. 350Zs, I mean, that was just a natural thing that happened because they were so popular and very cheap. RX-7s, same thing, like executive car. Eclipses, we got a couple of JDM 4G63s, but most of the Eclipses were just roller cars, just like the Civics. And I think most of these cars, even the Sylvia, were really the breeding grounds for the early modability for Japanese cars. They were pushing 500 horsepower, whereas most muscle cars were only around the 350 to 400, and they were beating out the quarter mile because they had just better suspension than most muscle cars. I mean, if you wanted to spend that extra 2 to 5 grand on the rear end, you could go with a muscle car, or you could just buy a Supra, put a couple mods on the front end, and that's it. You don't need to touch the rear end. So that was kind of interesting. But again, this was mostly California thing. Most people in the East End, we just never got a lot of these. And when they started coming in, it was not really for racing purposes because we already had a pretty good modding community. Here's a couple of engines that I mentioned, but I think are worth mentioning again because they're JDM legends. So here, RB26 DET. We didn't get that many of them. Most people preferred the RB25, and I believe that our Australian connection really helped us to build that modding community. The 2JZ, another classic engine. We didn't really get that many here. We got them mostly from the Australian connection. We had a lot more 1JZs, actually, the 2.5 liters. And I believe that they were pretty interchangeable, so that's how we got into them a lot. 13B Ruse. Now, these are like kind of, I would say they're a little overhyped from listening to other modders and so on and so forth. Like, actually, the FC engines, so the REs, are a lot more popular because anyways with the Ruse you would have to do a single turbo swap, which is pain in the ass, versus with the RE it starts with a single turbo and you could just put a bigger turbo pretty easily. It's literally just piping differences. SR20, we got a lot of NAs, and people were just putting turbo kits, like OEM turbo kits, onto them, which is cool. 4G63s, of course. B18s, those are good NA. 6G72s, also pretty good NA, although we got the twin turbos, which are kind of cool. Slept on, definitely slept on. C32, now that's the NSX engine, pretty good engine. 3S GTE, very good. F20C, so that's what we got in the S2000, and it's the highest revving inline 4 that we had at the time, which is pretty cool. EJ22G, also great legend, that's the 22B engine. And to be honest, the only thing is like we never really got that many of them. And the VG, which is also kind of like a deadweight engine, same way as like the 6G, because there just wasn't that many, and the tunability really lost on us. Now, the biggest JDM legends, in my opinion, is the R34 GTR. That one everyone loved when Too Fast and Too Furious came out. It looked mean, it drove great, it had the RP26 stock, and it was just a classic car. We really didn't see that many at all. Like, they were rarer than Lamborghinis back then. And the RX-7 FD, the third gen, I mean, it aged like fine wine. I mean, there was a time where they were pretty rare, but nowadays they're just absolutely incredibly rare. There was actually a time they were like priced like Corvettes, but there was like a quarter or a fifth less than the amount of Corvettes. I mean, there's so many Corvettes of the same year. I mean, and obviously the 8086. Now the 8086 like also aged like fine wine, I would say, but at first was actually kind of a trashy car. People didn't really unlock the performance out of them because, you know, there wasn't really that much to do to them. It's pretty similar to like MR2 first gens, but with the release of Initial D, people started liking them a lot more, which is kind of cool to see. Now let's go back into muscle cars. So I think that the LS is one thing that I think kind of dominated the last 10 years or 15 years of the car community, because, you know, between this and a 2JZ, this was 10 times cheaper to get into and maybe 20 times cheaper to mod. So I think it really started with the Gen 3 when we noticed that the Gen 3 heads had really high flow, which was very revolutionary for a small block. Small blocks had to be ported. You had to take out the engine and start building up the heads to do anything with them. And with the LS, the introduction of the LS1, I mean, that was no longer a thing. Now bolt-ons were a thing, and that directly competed with JDM, which was again a turbo kit kind of market. This was a stock warrantyable Edelbrock supercharger type setup. Some people like to put cams in them, just like they did with the SBCs, and that also netted a lot more horsepower than your average Japanese cam. Actually, cams for JDM engines was mostly of a maintenance thing. If you wanted to put a bigger turbo, you need bigger cams. For Americans, it was really to unlock that performance that you should have gotten in the factory, the 150 horsepower marks that we were getting here. And going back to what I was talking about earlier, which was the early 90s Camaros and Mustangs, but I will talk about that in a bit. You could get these LT1 Camaros, plop in a truck 5.3 or a LS1 if you wanted to, and you were already making, you know, over a super performance out in you know, like 7,000 to $12,000, which was again really cheap. Like, that's Big Mac dollars here. Some really cool other ideas was we got turbo setups for the LS1, and that quickly put the Corvettes back into the youth's idea. I mean, what I aspire to own is a Z06 because of this kind of thing. S10s also became really popular to put in, you know, LS swaps in them. Before that, it was the SBCs, but the LSs just were dominating the track for a really long time. They still are. And the C6 Z06 became also a great legend, a great collectible because of this era. And the 5th gen Camaro also iconized this era as an LS dominator with the LS3. So it was just incredible. The LS engine is really something to remember. If you want to remember one historical fact about cars, LS engine is just something to really think about. I mean, it was such a great engine. They were compact. They did a lot. You could do a lot to them, and they would make a bunch of power. We're talking 900, 1,000 horsepower, no problem, using the right gas, of course. And you could swap into whatever you wanted because they were so compact. Very, very small engines compared to some of the 4 cylinders and V6s we got at this time. With the modular history, it's kind of the opposite. It's one of these engines that were extremely forgettable at first. They had a very rough start. They had to compete with the Windsor, and the 4.6 was just, excuse me, naturally a more economical engine, and also it was an engine that at first had a lot of issues with the chain valve setup. That setup had to be replaced or fixed right from the get go, and in later years they just really didn't make the effort for it. You could think of it like, if you ever heard of the North Star story, the 4.6 kind of had that problem, and also they were kind of gutless at first, had a lot of issues with flow heads, and it took a lot to do to them before they were actually really good. The two valves, you had to put trick flow heads or nothing, and that only happened much later. So they had a rough start, but the reality of it is that they had a really big future ahead of them. The modding community really saved this engine, I want to say. When I talk about modding, I'm talking about Roush, SVT, and other people. And really, this is just a group of engineers that knew the potential of a modular and wanted to do something about it. And they did it through SVT. They made the 4-valve Cobra engine, or the Illuminator. And the Illuminator was a great engine because you could get it out of a Fox body, an SN95, and it was able to make a lot of power very fast compared to the regular 2-valve. Obviously not as fast as the LS engine, but let's just say it's still easier than, say, like a Supra. And also, these engineers were really fans of in and of themselves, but they also listened to the fans and they gave more. So the SVT Cobra R was a pretty good example of a situation where they wanted to show the concept of the Mustang, to show the fans how to deal with it and make a bunch of power, and it also showed the fans how to build a trick Fox body with a modular engine, and that's exactly what people did. We put big superchargers on the Cobra and the Illuminators. We put big superchargers on the 2 valves, and it made a bunch of power. It made a bunch of boost, and it started actually becoming an interesting car to mod. Later on, we got the Terminator, and we also got the GT500. Shelby came back, and it was such a great moment. I mean, we got a bunch of cool cars. We had the F-150 Lightning that I showed in the previous slide, which was put into the Ford GT, and that really started off the GT500 revolution, which were really the first 1,000 horsepower stock cars, muscle cars, or any car really, if you think about it. Obviously, the Terminator's first blocks to handle 1,000 horsepower, but the rest of the lineup is really just 1,000 horsepower stock. We got the Mercury Marauder. That was a pretty good engine to take out and put into other stuff. And later on, they listened to the fans big time by rebuilding the modular into the Coyote 5.0 engine, which in 2011, 2012 was really big news. 400 horsepower stock, finally competing with the LS6 and the LS2, and finally giving us a really bright future for modular. And I won't be talking about the current situation, which is kind of dominating quarter miles and so on and so forth, but you get the gist of it. And out of nowhere, I want to also mention big thanks to Hemi. Now, Hemis in and of themselves were pretty cool. I mean, they are the most old school engines you could think of. They're actually using dual spark plugs, which is really unheard of. The only 3 or 4 times in the history of engines that we did this. And the valve train was even more old school than the LS engines, and they made just as much power or more power. These are very easy to bore engines, and they're completely iron blocks, so they're actually really easy to port and easy to get new ones, and so on and so forth. They're just great engines, and they came out of nowhere. They came out of the concept of the Viper. The Viper engineers got together, they made SRT, and they started producing a bunch of cars for Dodge and Chrysler. And this came into fruition when they needed a new V8, a new luxury/performance engine. The Hemi V8 was such a good idea. It gave very good fuel economy. It was a very smooth engine, and it also had a lot of potential right from the get-go. I mean, 2006, 2007, we were already talking about 600, 700 horsepower Hemi engines, whereas the Cobras and the LS1s were really only touching that at that time. So they went from no V8 to a big performance bargain V8 in a matter of 4 or 5 years. They also had the new Mopar factory crate system, which allowed for people to buy crates off their magazine or off the phone numbers, and that was something that GM and Ford didn't really do until a little later on when they got jealous, and it was really the power for everyone. When you think about RTs and SRTs that we got, most of them were very very cheap, cheaper than your even some Camaros and Mustangs, and also they gave him pretty much all cars you could think of. So here's the SRT8. That's a Challenger SRT. That's a cop car that you could buy out of auction that was really cheap. Some people have bought them for $1,000, $500, and you were getting that 5.7. That's a Jeep with a Hemi. That's crazy. And the Rumblebee, which was really the first car or the first truck or first vehicle that got the Hemi and was made for performance. And this thing sold really, really well, which helped build that the momentum for the performance here. And obviously, we're going to get into the specifics about the performance when we're thinking about Hellcats and so on and so forth. So we'll talk about that in the next video. And that's pretty much it for the presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed, and come back for part 2.